This is one of those moments where you almost have to pause and say, wait, did that really just happen? Because while most people were focused on the usual noise, Canada quietly walked into a room with China and walked out with a deal that Donald Trump has spent years trying to prevent. And the scale of it is not small. It's not symbolic. It's structural. Canadian tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles have been slashed to just over 6%. Chinese EV imports have been formally approved, with nearly 50,000 vehicles cleared for entry. Canola tariffs that were choking Canadian farmers at 84% have collapsed to around 15%. And on top of all that, Canadians can now travel to China visa-free. This wasn't announced through leaks or speculation. It came directly from Prime Minister Mark Carney after his meeting with President Xi Jinping. And in my view, calling this diplomacy doesn't quite capture what's going on here. This looks more like a strategic realignment, one that reshapes Canada's economic options in a way that deeply complicates Donald Trump's entire trade playbook. Let's start with something most people overlook. This deal didn't materialize overnight. For more than a week, signals were coming out of Ottawa and Beijing that this visit wasn't ceremonial. Carney didn't fly across the world for photos and polite statements. Quiet groundwork had already been laid, and today was the moment it surfaced in public. After the meeting with Xi, Carney laid out what he described as a reset in Canada-China relations, built around three core pillars: electric vehicles, agriculture, especially canola, and long-term industrial investment inside Canada itself, not just imports, not just temporary access, physical production on Canadian soil. That's where things get interesting. Chinese electric vehicle tariffs being cut to about 6% matters on its own, but the bigger story is what comes next. Both governments have openly discussed expectations that within 3 years, Canada and China will have the infrastructure in place for EV manufacturing inside Canada. Not shipping cars across the Pacific forever, but building them in Canadian plants, using Canadian labor, embedded in Canadian supply chains. Here's why that matters. China currently produces some of the most affordable and energy-efficient electric vehicles in the world. Love it or hate it, that's simply the market reality. Canada has been trying to grow its own EV sector while keeping prices affordable for consumers, and those two goals often clash.
China produces some of the most affordable and efficient energy-efficient vehicles in the world. And in order for Canada to build our own competitive EV sector, we need to learn from innovative partners, access their supply chains, and increase local demand. And to help deliver the full potential of these partnerships and bring down costs for Canadians, Canada has agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market, with the most favored nation tariff rate of 6.1%. This is a return to the levels that existed prior to recent trade frictions. But it's a return under an agreement that promises much more for Canadians. It's expected that within 3 years, this agreement will drive considerable Chinese investment in Canada's auto sector, creating good careers in Canada and accelerating our progress towards a net zero future and the auto industry of the future. With this agreement, it's also anticipated that within 5 years, more than 50% of these vehicles will be affordable EVs with an import price of less than $35,000.
Learning from established manufacturers, accessing mature supply chains, and creating local demand all at once is the fastest way to close that gap. Under this agreement, Canada has agreed to allow up to 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles into the Canadian market at the most favored nation tariff rate. This roughly restores tariff levels that existed before recent trade frictions, but this time under a framework that's designed to evolve into domestic production rather than permanent imports. And here's the part most people misunderstand. This isn't about flooding the market with cheap cars and calling it a day. The expectation, according to officials involved, is that within 5 years, a majority of these vehicles will fall into the affordable category, with import prices under $35,000, while investment ramps up inside Canada's own auto sector.
China used to be the largest market for Canadian canola seed. We want to not just return to those levels, but to surpass them. And so I'm pleased today to announce that Canada and China have reached a preliminary but landmark trade agreement to remove trade barriers and reduce tariffs. By March the 1st, Canada expects that China will lower tariffs on Canadian canola seed to a combined rate of approximately 15%. China is a 4 billion canola seed market for Canadian producers, and this change represents a significant drop from the current combined tariff levels of 84%. Furthermore, Canada expects that Canadian canola meal, as well as Canadian lobsters, crabs, and peas, will not be subject to relevant anti-discrimination tariffs from March 1st of this year until at least the end of this year.
If that investment materializes, especially in Ontario, the implications are massive. Canadian jobs, Canadian assembly lines, Canadian leverage over pricing, affordable EVs built domestically in a G7 economy sitting right next to the US border. Now here's the twist. Donald Trump's entire strategy around electric vehicles has been built on isolation. Keep Chinese EVs out, pressure allies to do the same. Use tariffs and threats to wall off North America while simultaneously squeezing Canada's auto sector into alignment. This deal sidesteps all of that in one move. Vehicles manufactured inside Canada are not the same as imports from China. They exist in a different legal, economic, and political category. And Trump understands that perfectly. A competitive EV industry operating just north of the US border undermines the leverage he's relied on for years. But electric vehicles are only half the story. The real pressure release valve here is agriculture, and especially canola. Before this agreement, Chinese tariffs on Canadian canola products had reached a crushing 84%. For months, Canadian farmers, particularly in Western Canada, were absorbing the damage from a geopolitical standoff they didn't create. China was once Canada's largest canola export market. Losing that access didn't just hurt balance sheets, it created political strain at home. Ottawa's room to maneuver was limited, and that vulnerability was obvious. Today, that changes. China has agreed to slash canola tariffs to roughly 15%, restoring market access in a meaningful way. This isn't diplomatic phrasing or symbolic relief. This is billions of dollars in potential exports coming back into play. It stabilizes farm incomes, eases pressure in rural communities, and removes one of the most painful pressure points Canada has been dealing with. And it didn't stop there. Canadian canola meal, along with products like lobsters, crabs, and peas, are expected to be exempt from certain anti-discrimination tariffs through at least the end of the year. That kind of breadth tells you this wasn't an afterthought. Agriculture was a core demand, and Canada secured it. Then came the announcement that barely made headlines, but may prove just as influential over time. Visa-free travel. At first glance, that sounds minor compared to EVs and tariffs. It isn't. Visa-free access changes behavior immediately. Business delegations move faster. Tourism ramps up. Academic exchanges expand. Trade expos, conferences, and cultural events become easier to organize and attend. And importantly, it works both ways. Chinese tourists, students, and investors now see Canada as accessible again after years of freeze and friction. China is one of Canada's largest sources of tourism, and easing travel barriers tends to unlock money, momentum, and long-term relationships that don't show up in a single trade headline. This is the soft power layer sitting on top of a very hard economic reset. Some commentators have rushed to frame this as Canada choosing China over the United States. In my view, that framing is lazy and misleading. What this actually represents is Canada reducing dependency. For years, Trump's leverage over Canada worked because alternatives were limited. Auto threats worked, trade threats worked, tariffs worked. This deal weakens that leverage. Once factories are planned, investments scheduled, and supply chains begin shifting, those decisions don't quietly reverse. Markets adapt, capital moves, pressure loses its bite, and this is where the story turns back to Donald Trump. For decades, Canada was one of America's most reliable economic partners. Deeply integrated supply chains, shared industries, quiet trust built through cooperation. Trump disrupted that, not because Canada changed, but because his approach did. He chose public threats over private negotiation, tariffs over coordination, humiliation over partnership. This deal didn't come out of nowhere. It was pushed into existence by those choices. By treating Canada as expendable, Trump created the conditions for Canada to look elsewhere. And Canada responded, like any rational country would. It diversified. That's why this hits so hard. It's not just competition, it's replacement. Chinese-linked EV manufacturing in Canada complicates Trump's vision of a sealed-off North American auto industry. Canola relief stabilizes Canadian politics without U.S. involvement. Visa-free travel deepens ties Washington doesn't control. Trump didn't lose leverage because Canada betrayed him. He lost it because he burned it. Now the deal is signed. That part is done. What isn't settled is how the United States responds. Auto policy just got more complicated. Trade retaliation becomes riskier. Escalation now carries higher costs, and adaptation requires acknowledging that pressure no longer works the way it once did. Trump will have to decide whether he doubles down or adjusts, and that choice will shape Canada-US relations for years. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.